we're live. All right, so I'm going to transfer us out. All right. Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about roguelite deck builders. But before we do that, buddy, why don't you tell folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, it's pretty simple. On this podcast, we talk about games, and a certain game mode that I have played an obscene number of hours in is the dungeon run adventures in Hearthstone, which are these single player adventures where you're progressing through boss fights, you're picking up cards, putting them in your deck, etc. Which is pretty similar to another very popular indie game called Slay the Spire, which came out a couple of years ago but just released on mobile. And so I guess the question is, where does the appeal for these games come from?
Yeah, and
Um,
just to put it in perspective, I just picked up the mobile version of Slay the Spires. First time I've played, but I have played the Hearthstone version of this as well, and they're always like super compelling. I think that like Slay the Spire has a little bit of a leg up on Hearthstone in that is the entire game rather than kind of like trying to retrofit it on top of the competitive thing from Hearthstone. But they've also had versions of this. I think they had a version of it in an MTG arena. I think it might have been also like a canned version uh like Commander or something in the beta. I haven't
I
played that in a
also
while.
think Hearthstone has a certain advantage in the sense that because it is adjacent to the competitive mode, it has something to compare itself to.
Right.
Like, and we can get into that in more specific detail. But like that definitely does create some interesting um, sort of contrasting factors because I think there are whole game systems that exist in Hearthstone that would probably not exist in a more straightforward kind of like roguelike deck builder system. And I bet that those systems I've never played Slay the Spire. I bet that those systems are probably there in Slay the Spire.
Yeah, so there's some cool like so the big thing that Slay the Spire thing has going for it in terms of not only in terms of like being dedicated to it, but it's got like in Hearthstone it's kind of like play matches one after another and then add packs in between, which is a good version of that. But Slay the Spire has like a map and it has like you can roughly pick your way up the spire essentially and take different encounters and change them slightly and like target different things. And there's a couple more mechanics built around it, like there are relics and potions and things that are kind of like temporary and just like you would expect, slightly more fleshed out. Um,
Yeah.
and but similar, like kind of like you can get into wacky like roguelikes. In general, you kind of get these where you're like aiming towards like a wacky build that'll like totally like you know maybe trivialize is the wrong, maybe it is like there are runs of every roguelike where you're kind of pointing at, you manage to trivialize the run, which can be super satisfying. um Hell, even you even get that in Torghast sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Um but I feel like with the deck builders, I think this might be the key to it, is it's harder to get to like a truly trivializing position, but it's easier to kind of get in the realm of it without like being by totally screwed by the RNG, right? If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, I that definitely makes sense to me. And I think this is one of the weird things that's interesting about Hearthstone, and why Dungeon Run was very appealing for me for so long. Because like there's always a fantasy in any of these kinds of games, right? Like when you're playing Magic the Gathering, when you're playing Hearthstone, right? Like any of these kind of competitive games, where you look at a couple of cards and you recognize a synergy and you're just like, oh, that's so cool. Like, wouldn't it be so sweet if I did this and this and this, right? Um, but like that stuff sometimes just doesn't materialize in PvP play, right? Like the combo is too clunky. It's an aggro meta, and this is a value deck. It's a value deck that gets outvalued by other decks, right? Or it's a weapon meta, and so people are running a lot of weapon hate, and you're never going to be able to get this thing off or whatever, right? Like you're for every cool synergy that you run into, you also have that chance of running into the wall of the meta, essentially, right? But in a single player dungeon run mode, you get to just go buck wild. And so there's something that's really satisfying about like, oh, I want to play Elemental Shaman, but Elemental Shaman fucking sucks and would just get dumpstered on ladder. So I go into dungeon run mode, and now I'm in shaman, and I'm picking up these elemental cards, and I get to kind of like play the fantasy that like those cards and their synergies are. I don't know. I want to say sort of like offering,
Yeah.
and that feels great. Like that feels like so cool and so fun. When those builds do come together.
Not only that, but like you can make like the it is permissible to allow those builds to be like more attainable, right? Like there are special dungeon run only mode cards, um, and they can be broken in a way that would be like unfun to play against if you could get that to work against another player, right?
Yep,
Like
absolutely.
being able to absolutely like smash down on the on the dungeon run and just like totally like you know oh fuck the your dungeon run is totally permissible in a way that you can't allow people to do on the ladder otherwise it becomes like either rocket taggy or just play against dominant strength, that kind of.
Yeah, and it's also something about like one of the things that I mentioned is like the aggro meta value meta sort of thing, right? Like that's something that really kicks in Dungeon Run. I've felt where like you actually do need to have a good understanding of like the fundamentals of how card games work in terms of like tempo and in terms of value, because like some of your games will go to fatigue and you will get outvalued by an opponent because the opponents are these AIs with very well crafted decks to like kind of exploit certain things, but you can also really get blitzed down by those opponents sometimes. So like you have to be very careful about where you're building your like where you're building your deck, where you're finding your value that's going to allow you to go into the long game, but like also survive those early turns. And that's honestly something that's like ended a ton of my dungeon runs before, right? Like I'm picking up the right value cards, but I'm not picking up the right tempo cards. So I mulligan a full hand of like 9 cost minions that are just like sitting there and doing absolutely nothing, right? Um, or the opposite where I have played all of my murlocs in this murloc deck and I'm just like top decking every turn and I'm watching the opponents like you know board clears completely devastate me turn after turn.
Yeah, no, and I get that too because like so this is the thing that I think that's interesting about these types of games is I often find that like the toughest part of the run. Actually applies to Torghast too, which is a little bit outside of this episode directly, but like the toughest part of the run is like the second or third kind of like like the early middle, if that makes sense. You don't have enough cards that you've probably put together like a very solid like strategy,
Hmm.
um but and like and you've scaled up in power that like if you want to make plays for the long run you have to kind of like gamble a little bit about things you'll get down the road and you haven't quite found all the pieces yet, but the stuff is power has power enough up enough that they can beat like your very basic kind of level one cards that like early levels have to be easy because no one has anything, like no run has anything good. um you have a similar
That is
experience.
definitely a big pain point. I feel like I also feel like a big pain point is uh right when I'm about to get something big. So in Dungeon Run, these are the even decks, right? So every two or like after every fight, you get a treasure or whatever. But like the enemies scale up over the course. It's typically 8, right? Over the course of 8, and you get the treasures on. Oh, I guess I'm talking about the odd decks, right? You get the treasures on the odd ones. So 1, 3, and 5 and 7 are much harder. It feels like than 2, 4, 8, 6, and 8 because on 2, 4, 6, and 8 I've just gotten a treasure and made my deck that much more powerful. Um, whereas on the other ones, I don't have that same kind of spike of power in that same way. Also, later in the run, you can really dilute your deck with bad shit sometimes. Um, like I find that a lot of the time, because so the way it works in Dungeon Run is you start with 10 cards and you add 3 per turn plus 1 treasure. So at the end of the run, you're gonna have you're gonna have like a 44 card deck, right? The odds of drawing what you want to draw in a 44 card deck are a lot worse than in a 20 card deck. And so like sometimes you can really hose yourself because you're getting into those sort of like late game turns and you just don't have the sort of you don't have the engine to draw into the stuff that you are looking for deeper into your deck, and you can kind of flounder for that reason.
Same thing is actually very true instead of Spire. There's actually a couple of mechanics to remove cards from your deck if you want to. There's also other reasons to do that too. Like you can like take on bad cards, like they're called curses, and you usually can't pull them out of your hand. And they like have various bad effects, but you know, like I said, it's got slightly more advanced systems than the Hearthstone one does because it's totally built around it. But like it's definitely true, right? Like you know,
Mm,
you get too far down, you've got Slay the Spire decks can like vary, right? Like there's essentially each deck starts out with 5 basic attacks, 5 basic blocks, and like a couple of specialized cards per character. There's like 4 different characters. Um, and they all work very differently, which is I think a huge strength of the system. Um, but like towards the end of a run, if you're just kind of like pulling things like willy nilly, you will have like an incoherent deck and not be able to like find the stuff you need for it. Um, and it'll be tough, but you know, there's just so something I think I really appreciate about say Spire over the Hearthstone is just like so much depth that like gets can get screwed by randomness, but like it's got a lot more kind of like edges to kind of like push against than Hearthstone does, just because the larger variety of mechanics. Like
hmm
each there's 4 characters and each one has like 2 or 3 significant play styles that you can like push toward, mechanics that are like they're good at that you can push towards. Um, and so like I like one of my early runs with the character's called Defect. He's like a robot, and his unique thing is he has like orbs that float around him that do things passively at the end of the turns. And if you fill up your orb slots and push one out, it like does a big thing. So like the basic one is like electricity, and at the end of your turn, it'll do 3 damage to an enemy. If you push it out, you'll do 8 damage to a random enemy. I had a run where I basically like got a card that would like super boost my what is effectively the equivalent of mana. It's called energy. It will super boost it to like a ludicrous number. And then another card that will like spend all of your mana and just generate those lightning orbs for each one. Like if I got that combo in hand, it'd be like energy. It's called Tempest, and just like waiting there for 15 minutes while like the orb cycle and like just devastate the enemies. Like that's like one very small aspect of the defect, right? Like you can also there's like one that builds there's an orb that builds up armor. There's like strategies around like using multiple types of orbs. One's around like searching for and replaying a couple different cards. Um, like I said, it's a very very interesting game. I think the variety is key into like playing it over and over and over again. Right? Like I
Yeah.
found like you've played them. You've played the dungeons I think much more than I have. Right? I usually kind of beat it once and I'm pretty done with it. But um, there's just like I feel like there's a similar amount of like difference there. Right? Like I don't think it's
Yeah, part of it is that one it's using wild, right? Excuse me. So it's not pulling for it's pulling from a card pool of thousands of cards at that point, probably like 1,500 cards for some of the earlier sets, and then every Hearthstone set adds another 135. So we're probably at like 2,000 by more recent standards, which I think is really neat and really cool. Um, and then also the classes, right? Doing dungeon run with 9 different classes is just means that you just have a lot of inherent variety, because choosing a paladin is going to make your run different than choosing a priest, obviously. Though some of them have had fewer. So for instance, in the monster hunt dungeon run, there's only 4 classes. In the old Doom dungeon run, there's only 4 classes as well, but the 4 classes are doubled classes, right? So it's like warrior hunter, you know. Um, but I do think that there is a lot of like there is a lot of like variety to some of those things, just because of how one the hero powers work. Because in a lot of like in the later dungeon runs, you can change your hero power to like at the start of the game you choose one hero power or another sort of thing, and then also what your starting deck looks like, right? Like, are you going to start with these 10 cards or those 10 cards, or like where that kind of like play style comes from. Where in Torghast, I feel like Torghast is a little suffocated almost by build variety. Like, I feel like I have a lot of build variety as an arms warrior. I can go for this execute build. I can go for like an AoE, like a cooldowns build where I'm like really pumping my cooldowns. I can go for a whirlwind build where every mortal strike is casting whirlwind. It feels like a lot of other classes don't have that kind of option. Um, based on the way that I talk to people. Like when I talk to a friend of mine who plays Death Knight, he is always looking for one power, and his like run is dependent on whether or not he gets that. Obviously, I haven't played Death Knight, so I can't like speak to that, inherently, right? But like if the success or failure of your entire run is built off of getting one, like one power, that's a pretty dire circumstance to be in.
Yeah, and part of that with Torghast is again that it's a secondary system, right? Like
Yeah.
um the classes are coming from like relatively set positions, but I think it's a useful comparison, right? You've played a lot of um you're gonna hate me. I can't remember the name of your company's roguelite.
Oh,
Uh,
gone viral.
Gone viral, yes. And I've played a bit of that. I've also played a ton of Enter the Gungeon, and other kind of and a handful of other roguelikes. There's a side-scrolling shooty one that escapes me, but I played a ton of these different games, and something that the uh the the regular roguelikes I think have that's as a flaw is it's hard to smooth out the curve, right? Like
Hmm.
there are runs of Gungeon where like I just can't like within like if I don't get like something decent within like the first two floors, like well this is gonna be tough, right? And like you can really sink a run that way. This is especially true of like say the original Rogue where things were like very random. It was super luck based. Um,
Yeah, Fail in the chat, by the way, points out that I think it's more to do with how much you like a set of powers over whether or not there is more than one to pick from. Like, only one build is OP DPS, where others are more versatile, and as a player, I might prefer to just play the damage build over the others. I do think that that's very fair, right? Like, I mix and match all the time as an arms warrior just because I'm happy to do any of those, right? I just kind of want variety. I don't want to be, drinking the same cup of coffee every day basically. But I definitely would get that sense that like if you're the kind of person who wants to clear Torghast as quickly as possible, maybe you just like laser into your one, you're going to do the touch of death build every time because you know it works and it's sensible shoes. And I think that that's perfectly fair.
yeah, and part of that like I don't think that part of it is that Torghast isn't one particularly hard, and two doesn't have a lot of those same kind of mechanics. I think all like that roguelikes in general have, right? Like a lot of roguelikes depend on having a relatively limited health pool, um, that's kind of consistent, and like ways to avoid damage as a thing. Whereas like the WoW mechanics just don't support a lot of that, right? Like you can avoid some stuff and you can do like your stuns, right? And like they try and emulate that with some of the trap stuff, but like at the end of the day, you still have your ability to heal yourself. You still have the ability to kind of like eat food and like top up between each fight. Um, and so the general challenge for Rogues just doesn't match up as well with kind of the WoW core systems, and so it's
Yeah.
tougher to pull off and tougher to build in variety that would be meaningfully different, right? Like
Yeah,
they're
also I think WoW's core gameplay surrounding rotations means that there's only like so much variety that you can possibly create, right?
yeah
In Gone Viral, I can have runs which are attack speed focused, melee. I can have ranged runs where I'm trying to do range stuff. I can have wallop runs. I can have all these different sorts of runs because like the core functionality of my character can change dramatically, right? Essentially, walking into Gone Viral, I don't have a class, and I define my class through the powers that I'm picking up. So I would, kind of be like warrior, doing like warrior stuff, maybe if I'm picking up good armor and weapons, but I'm doing mage stuff if I'm picking up a rocket launcher, right? Sort of to analogize those, if that makes sense. In Torghast, I'm never walking into Torghast on Bairn and ending up as range DPS or ending up as a tank. You know what I mean? Like I'm walking in as the thing that I am, and I have to, like I have to be confined by that like that core. And I do think that like I said that there are ways to spice that up, but like at the end of the day, I'm describing three builds when I say here's one build, it's the execute build. Here's another build, it is the Bladestorm build. Here's a third build, it's the Whirlwind build. That's it, basically, right? Like there's just not a lot else that you can do there because at the end of the day, WoW's moment to moment mechanics are going to be about hitting buttons like Fists of Fury and Mortal Strike um, over, over basically anything else in the game, which is interesting to bring it back to like Hearthstone, right? Because that's not the case for the classes in Hearthstone, right? Like classes in Hearthstone tend to have more abstract strengths and weaknesses. So armoring up and getting huge health pools is a strength of warrior that few other classes have, but like the mechanics to get there are very different, right? Like not every class is, and like, or like not every card is going to be like an armor card. And if I want to go an armor build, I can get there in radically different ways each time, right? Or if I want to go Murloc Shaman, I can go Murloc Shaman with a bunch of different kinds of Murlocs because there's 50 of them, right? Rather than just my one mortal strike, which is going to always be there, basically. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was gonna say like to like this. I think positions the card the roguelike deck builder is kind of like a midway between like Torghast, which I think is like very much kind of on the determinative end, and like there's like
Mm.
a few like not a lot of choices because like most of the bases like 90% of what you have is like your character that you're bringing, which is like a not insubstantial investment from a totally different game essentially, right? Versus something like Gone Viral or Enter the Gungeon where there's actually not a ton of places to make meaningful choices, right? Like it's a lot of it's just based on what drops. There's a couple places in each game, but a lot of it's just kind of like, you know, what the run happens to give you. Whereas these deck builder games, like there's a little like both Slay the Spire and Hearthstone have a little bit that you choose going into it. You choose like rough class, same thing as Slay the Spire. Um, but because like the game absolutely wouldn't work if it just threw absolutely random stuff at you. Like Slay the Spire, you choose one of three cards after every fight. There's a lot more fights than there are in Hearthstone. Um, Hearthstone is like you pick a pack of like three cards after every fight.
Yeah, it is one bucket of like, it's like a pack of 3 cards, but it's one of 3 of those, right? So you
Yeah,
essentially see nine cards, and you get to choose.
and they're not
Um,
random buckets, right? They're like themed buckets generally, right?
yeah, and so so the buckets will be like dragons, right? And the buckets also key off of the cards that are already in your deck. Or Taxi, it's not quite true. It keys off of the buckets you have previously chosen, right? So if on turn 1 you choose dragons, your turn 2 choice will have dragons more often than it will have whatever elementals,
Randoms,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, so it does allow you to kind of create like themed stuff. Something I've learned, and this is not very well telegraphed or anything like that, but like something I learned pretty quickly is that like that first choice matters a lot. And there were times where I would take a worse bucket, but that is in a better sort of like class of buckets, because I didn't want to take something that I knew was going to kind of like gum up my choices for the rest of the run. So, for instance, there are very good there was like these mage spells called, or there was a mage bucket called Spell Slingers, right? Which is like cheap, effective spells like Arcane Explosion, 2 mana, do 1 damage to everything, right? Frostbolt, 2 mana, 3 damage to a minion, freeze it, right? Those spells are really good and they're great, but they are not like a cornerstone of your deck, right? And so a lot of the times I would, like I would much rather have a bucket of Frostbolt, Arcane Explosion, and whatever else to have in my deck, just because those are good all around cards that will do sensible things that I need to do. I need to have removal in the deck. I need to have AoE in the deck or whatever. But on that first choice, I would rather choose something that kind of sets a better pace for myself, if that makes sense, like elementals or like secrets, for instance, that's a real core that you can actually build the deck around, which I think was like a really interesting piece of the design of Dungeon Run, and probably what makes it. I mean, I honestly think that makes it a little bit more robust than something like Gone Viral or Enter the Gungeon, right? Like some of the other like
yeah,
true roguelikes I play, because of the nature of the, and that's just about drawing cards from a deck. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
you are essentially building a more complete mechanical core in a roguelike deck builder than you are in an action roguelike.
Yeah.
Because in an action roguelike, you still have, you know, the bedrock of your game still includes moving around in the 3D space and like shooting stuff, right? You get to make more choices when the deck is just such a huge percentage of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Like the core of Gone Viral and Enter the Gungeon are like you can get core mastery over the movement mechanics and theoretically win the game with like no upgrades at all and like base mechanics and like being good.
Mhm.
Whereas like there's just like you can't be good at it. Like being good at a deck builder game is building the, or the deck builder game is building the deck in some
Yeah.
regard, right? So like um you can't outscale static numbers in a lot of ways.
That
Um
is absolutely true. I really think that that is fair. And I actually think and I like that way of thinking about it too, right? Like, which isn't a ding on any of these action roguelikes.
yeah.
I think that they're all
They're
great,
different games,
obviously.
yeah.
Yeah. But it really does put into perspective the kinds of choices that I'm making in the roguelite deck builders compared to the choices that I'm making in sort of the action games, right? Like I like the choices that I'm offered in God of Hyrule for, like what to buy at the shop, or for instance, just even the finding the vault, you have two mutations and you have to make the choice about which one's better. A lot of the times those are really interesting choices, but the Hearthstone version of that is just fundamentally more complex.
Yeah.
Because even stuff like, man, like I got worried about choices I was making about gumming down my deck, um, with cards that are in that are like incorrectly costed, right? Because you can like screw your curve over, right? This is one of the big things about dragons. The dragon bucket includes both cards that are powerful late game payoff dragons that have a lot of value, and early game cards that care about dragons that are tempo focused, right? So an example of that might be Alex Strauss's champion. It's a 2/3 for 3, or 2/3 for 2. Um, but it gets +1 attack and charge if you have a dragon in your hand, right? That's an amazing tempo card. Being able to put down a 3/3 with charge on 2 is huge, and is like the kind of tempo that you need in a dragon deck in order to like, you know, bring that home in order to survive those early game turns so that you can just like slam Onyxia and Nose Dormu every turn or whatever else. Um, but the problem is that Alex Strasza's champion is in the exact same bucket as the Nose Dormus and Alex Strasza's. And so there are times when you are looking at a dragon bucket that should be good for your deck, but you know that you're just going to fill your deck with chop end. Or you're filling deck with conditional shit like Alex Strasza's champion without having the dragons to then like support it. And that's just like it's such a complex set of decisions to be making, because you're making decisions about like, okay, well, what percentage of my deck are dragons now? What's my likelihood of drawing dragons when I need to have a dragon in my hand and hold it so that on turn 2 I can have Alex Strasza's champion out and charging, right? Like all of those kinds of things are just so much more elaborate, I guess I would say, and complicated compared to other like the choices that I'm making in other roguelikes.
Yeah. Or, in a lot of ways the choice you're making is something like Torghast, right? Like
Mhm.
which is, has some choice, but like I don't know. I hate to keep harping on Torghast, but like it's also one of those things where like if you're doing Torghast run solo, there's like a whole class of powers that aren't like particularly useful, which is how I
That's
usually
huge for
play.
Rogue. Yeah, in Rogue, it's really frustrating because in Torghast, there's a bunch of powers that are keyed off of Vanish, which is where you just boom, immediately enter stealth, right? But the problem is that if you vanish and you're the only person in combat, they all reset. So you can't like be in the boss fight and then vanish and do cool vanish tricks because you just fucking reset the boss. And that kind of stuff like sucks, obviously.
Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting because Torghast is a
Yeah, the victory rush power for arms warrior is a big example of that. Because in a solo run, Victory Rush procs when you kill a guy. This is fail in the chat, by the way.
yeah
Victory Rush procs when you kill a guy, right? But you have to deal the killing blow. So there's a power that says every time you use Victory Rush, you get 5 Phantasma. When you're solo, you are killing everything. Nobody is going to kill anything except for you. But if you're in a group of 5 people, your Victory Rush procs are so much less, common, and that sucks.
yeah. No, that would make sense for like my Death Touch build would potentially have similar problems, although usually not because Death Touch has enough damage that you can probably take the kill out from under some. Like if I was with you and you took the Victory Rush power and I was doing a Death Touch build, be like lol lol lol, and I'd be like Death Touching
Yeah.
everything out from under you.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, I also think Torghast is hampered because you technically have to be able to go into Torghast with all 3 specs. Like, or sorry, to put this a better way, you aren't locked to your spec when you enter Torghast, so you can't make intricate powers that are based off of spec mechanics, because every power has to have like a convenient alternate use in a different spec. So for instance, in the Mortal Strike ability, where it's like your Mortal Strike also casts Whirlwind. Whirlwind is a power that all warriors have, right? And in Fury, that's Rampage cast Whirlwind, and in Prot, it's Shield Slam cast Whirlwind. So like you can't make a power that like I don't know what's like a really for like Windwalker, for instance. You know, you're getting the mastery by doing like the rhythm game thing or
Yeah.
whatever. You couldn't really make a power that keys into that because that's specific to Windwalker. Obviously, Fistweavers and Brewmasters aren't doing like those mechanics. And conversely, if I'm making a power for Brewmaster, I can't make a power that is just cool shit your stagger does because Windwalker and Mistweaver don't have access to stagger.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of powers that do stuff with brews, and Windwalkers have like one brew, and so it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
Um,
it's funny.
yeah, I mean, I think like the other thing that I think is like I think Torghast, at least for Night Fae, the Covenant powers are not very good. But or I mean, the ones that are specific to like the Phalanx Stomp powers are pretty good, but like the Soul Shape
Oh, like
powers,
what Soul Shape does? Yeah,
yeah,
this was me in Fleshcraft for a long time. There was the Torghast power, which was basically the worst power ever. Fleshcraft used to scale based on the corpse that you were fleshcrafting on, right? You kill a powerful guy, you fleshcraft on his corpse, you get a bigger shield than if you fleshcraft on nothing. And there was a power that said Maw Rats count as bosses, essentially, for the sake of fleshcraft. And I was just like, what a worthless power, right? Like,
yeah, like that's I yeah that makes sense because like I mean I feel like all the Marat powers are like kind of like iffy at best because like they're like
yeah.
okay in the general, but like the only thing you care about is that end fight, right? Like,
Yeah,
uh,
I think that's a huge problem of Torghast is that when you get to a certain point in Torghast, the only thing that's threatening is the final boss. And so everything you pick up that doesn't interact with the final boss really isn't super useful. Yeah, so like mob rat powers are a beginner's trap. That's kind of true, right? Like if you can't clear the trash in Torghast, I think it's just much harder for you to clear the final boss. So I will say that I have had trouble sometimes because some powers I find. So for instance, the execute build on arms um, can actually be a trap a little bit because most of like the floors on Torghast are asking you to do AoE damage, and the execute thing is very single target focused. So there have been times when I got like no defensive powers and I was running the execute build. And I was actually getting kind of in like hairy positions just because I couldn't. It was a waste of my time to whirlwind. My whirlwind stuff wasn't doing to do AoE stuff. That wasn't doing enough damage. Um, but like sitting there and single targeting down each individual mob was like kind of a dangerous like proposition. So the bosses were easy, but like actually getting through a group or like having a group of two, like that's the kind of stuff that was hard. But even then, like part of it is that like that was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after Torghast came out, and I was pushing layer 8 before it was nerfed, and I was under geared for that content. And so it's like uh, now, like I beat all of the Torghast levels by 25 item levels. So I'm pretty sure I could take no powers and just completely steamroll a lot of the time.
yeah, no, I feel like we could take like I feel like a team could definitely do that. Like solo's a little bit tougher just because like they do scale up a bit. But like
Mm,
yeah, like the Touch of Death build is not exactly a boss friendly build, but you just need a couple pieces to like make that work, right? Like you just need to like get under whatever threshold to be able to do the Touch of Death. But it's like those powers are mostly about clearing floors faster because you don't want to be bothered doing that because that's kind of boring, right? Which I think is like, not a great like I think that's the ultimate truth of what it is, and that's not great because like that's what Dorghast is, right? Is like mostly clearing those floors, which is
yeah.
unfortunate. I have
There are also powers that I think are almost intentionally uninteresting in a way. Like this is the other thing with the execute power. The only thing you do is you cast execute. Also, the same thing is true for the Bladestorm power. It doesn't make your Bladestorm more powerful. It just increases the duration. So I hit Bladestorm and I'm just sitting there spinning for 15 seconds. That's it. Like, that I can't use any moves or abilities, and I just have to hope that Bladestorm is strong enough to like bring stuff down or whatever. and like I don't know. That's the I guess that's the nature of the beast. I will say that honestly, some of the most interesting times in Torghast for me have been when I'm interacting with the stationary mechanics, right? Like of the floors themselves. Like the Soul Forge Embers, which is constantly hitting you for 10% of your health. That one is really interesting. And I am more engaged running that floor probably than any of the others. Just because I'm constantly thinking about like I'm losing 10% of my health every tick and I need to like keep moving and I need to find healing where I can to keep myself topped off so I don't kind of like bleed out to this fire damage.
Yeah, but then that gets trivialized by getting the Ravaged Anima Cell or whatever it is.
That's true, but I actually also think low key the ravenous anima cells are also kind of a trap. I basically don't take them anymore because I just don't find them all that good. There's like a couple of small things that are like really good, like Uh, there's the archers. If you ravenous an archer, you get 10 to 20 souls, which I just think is huge, right? Because souls are 1% primary stat each. Um, there's the decreased fire damage one, if you want to trivialize the fire damage, and there's the one that makes like the bone marrow guys drop 10% or 10 times as much phantasma. Those are the only ones I think are like really worth it with the ravenous anima cell, and most of the times I just skip it basically.
Yeah, no, I do too. Um, like I said, like I use it for the fire ones, and I occasionally use it for the Phantasma ones, but a lot of that's dependent on like what's available. But like like the mounts inside of Torghast are like like a super big trap, right? Like any of the movement speed ones, like who cares, right? Like,
I don't know. To be honest, I kind of take those more and more nowadays.
really?
Since I've learned that I can more or less blitz Torghast down, I will sometimes just take like the Malrat mount just to like run faster and save myself the whatever the 5 or 10 minutes it's gonna save of my real life time running Torghast.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Like, maybe I've got like the wrong perspective since I'm a monk and I could just like roll through everything forever. And like I've got a lot of inherent mobility. That means I don't need the mount as much, especially in this because
Yeah, I also will say that, by the way, Torghast has improved since 9.0.5 because they've added more powers in, right? So there's a lot more variety, right? Like this is one of the things that's really fun about the dungeon runs. When I was doing dungeon runs, I was constantly changing, right? So my rule was I was going from class to class to class. So when I start and I do, whatever it is, right? Like rogue, warrior, warlock, priest, mage, and you go all the way around back to warrior. By the time you're back to warrior, you have done 9 intervening dungeon runs. And so like you kind of get to refresh yourself. Um which I also think is not the case with Torghast, right? Because Torghast is encouraging you to run the same, like to run on the same characters every week. I'm sure if Solas was a global currency, right, and I could be running it on a number of different characters, and I was following that same sort of thing where I was going arms warrior, demonology warlock, assassination rogue, like all the way down the line, I would probably be having a much better time with it because I have that ability to sort of like like change things up, which is just part of the like the MMO design, I guess. Versus the roguelike card game design. Like even Slay the Spire with 4 characters, you can do that with just 1, 2, 3, 4, and I feel
yeah.
like that would be a huge
Oh yeah,
difference.
yeah, absolutely. They also have like daily runs, which have like a bunch of modifiers on them, which is but yes. Um, Uh, that's definitely the case. Like Torghast for me, like I run Torghast when I have an emissary quest to do Torghast, and I just haven't been doing them for the past couple weeks. Like I don't have the gold support building out more legendaries. It's like, well, about to top out on Soul Ash. Why bother, right? Like,
They actually removed the cap on Soul Ash
oh,
in
did they?
9.0.5.
Oh, good to
Yeah,
know.
I
Still
think
probably won't do it, but
I think I technically have the max level of Soul Ash possible because I cleared it at the max level and I've done every single Soul Ash mission I could. Maybe I would have generated them earlier. I don't actually know how the Soul Ash missions work, but I've like succeeded every Ash mission I've ever gone on. So, um, like at this point, I've gotten it all done. But part of where I am in WoW right now is like I'm finding a lot of fun. It's probably a weekly quest. So yeah, I think you're right, Philonor. I'm finding a lot of fun like putting together different builds inside of my spec. Um, so like Whereas in a certain sense, when I'm doing Hearthstone stuff, right, I'm like walking into it completely blind or like completely fresh, right? It now when I'm working on my warrior, it's about finding stuff inside of the warrior, like finding small changes or optimizations to the playstyle inside of my warrior that are making that gameplay like more fun or interesting, if that makes sense.
It does. It
Um,
does. Um,
so when it comes to, do you feel like in Slay the Spires, you are getting into like what does early game, mid game, late game sort of like look like when it comes to the different phases of kind of like combat?
yeah. So, early games, a lot of kind of like very early game can be a little bit repetitive because like it's mostly just like I said, there's you've got basic attack and defense cards which are like add 5 shields, do 5 damage, and like that's it. And you get like a couple little flavor things or a couple of like base components for your character. Um, but you don't have much. A lot of it is kind of like making sure you don't build out too far in one direction so that you have all offensive cards and you're going to be screwed on the defensive side and vice versa. Um, Making sure you can play against the enemies properly. Um,
Okay, that's interesting.
but it's also at some point it quickly becomes about targeting what you're going for, right? Like, are you going for a lightning build on the defect? If you're playing the second character, I forget what her name is, but got a poison mechanic. Like, are you focusing on building a poison? Are you focusing on her things that target weakness? Are you focusing on a couple of her powers that are focused on like low cost cards and like drawing a bunch of cards? Um, like the a run I did today with the he's one of the more famous characters. It's like a blind martial artist that has different stance, and she like today I was focused more on kind of just cycling cards and like using that to like just continuously deal damage in like a turn and like building up energy and dropping it, kind of going. And whereas you can focus on stance changes, right? Like the two primary stances are, one is like um this kind of like, one, it only does something when you exit it and it gives you bonus energy, and then the other one is you do damage, double damage, you take double damage. So kind of the natural rhythm, if you're going for the stance stuff, is get into calm, get to a point where you have an enrage card, pop out of a calm into enrage and use the extra energy you get
Oh,
from that.
interesting.
Yeah.
To like
That,
really hit somebody. That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah, and that's like kind of like the very, like, if you like look at it, be like, oh, this is the basic mechanic for how this character works, right? Mitigate the risk, and then you start building other things like well, like this run, I basically kind of ignored that and just stayed in calm for most of it when I could, and like pop out of it if I needed to. And I'd focus on her other stuff um, like she's got a bunch of scrying powers, and there's a couple of cards that will pull out of your discard pile if you scry. Basically, the way, so just to lay it out, since I know you don't play and people at home play,
Hmm.
at the top of your turn, you generally draw 5 cards, and you've got 3 energy to deal with it. And then at the end of your turn, your hand gets discarded um, into the discard pile. And when you run out of cards, you reshuffle the deck and start again. Um, and they're like so. One of the her bigger powers is retain, which is parts stay in your hand instead of being discarded into this card pile. And she's got a couple of powers, which are kind of like you have to cast them once each fight, but they're like buffs that stick around, and you don't replay them generally. Um, so like I had one that's like I managed to get myself in a situation where I always had a card called Battle Hymn. It had a trait called Innate, which means that it's always in your starting hand. So Battle Hymn puts a smite into your hand every turn. Smite is a cheap, just damaging spell. So it was basically, and they retain. So it was basically building those up and like keeping myself basically surviving while just really spamming those. And that was basically how I there was some other mechanics there too. Like the other thing I was talking about, there's this card called Weave, which 0 cost, light damage, but its thing is if you scry, you pull it out of the discard. And so bunch of scry cards that just like scry is actually almost exactly how it works in Magic. You look at the
Mm.
top X cards and you can discard as many of them to your discard as you want. Um so just like kind of like looping those things. I didn't engage with the stance mechanic at all. But if you wanted to, you could go deep into the stance mechanic and just keep popping back. There's ways to just exit your stance arbitrarily. there's a couple different cards that you can retain. Um, that like I said, that'll let you like switch stances. And there's a third stance that you can only get through like added cards called it's like a mantra to I forget what the ultimate state is, but you do triple damage and you gain a bunch of energy, but it only lasts for a turn. So right, like there's I played with that on a couple different runs where you basically build to a crescendo, um, and like then you're like slamming things out on that turn, trying to run through as much as possible, and then you're kind of being conservative. Um,
Interesting. Yeah, I've definitely had a similar sort of experience in Dungeon Run sometimes. Like, there's one card in I think the old Doom set that says it's like arcane missiles, but for 5 mana, right? So arcane missiles does 1 damage to everything, but it upgrades so it's inside of your deck and it upgrades for every spell that you've cast this game. So you can build your whole deck around that. And I sometimes did for these like really explosive like turns where you're just like you're playing spells that put spells in your hand and then playing and like getting all those out, all with the payoff of like drawing this one card and then just like slamming it for 300 damage or whatever,
yeah.
like
Oh
whatever the
yeah,
number is.
yeah, yeah. No, that's similar things too. But like that's and there's four like that's one character. I described like 3 or 4 different ways to play her, and there's 4
Hmm.
characters. So and the bosses all have like there's a bunch of like little mechanics in here too that like you don't get in Hearthstone just because again it's it's not built for it. But like um but then you get to like places where like the last boss like one of the final bosses is a thing that like if you play too many cards like if you uh 12th card you play like across turns just ends your turn there and he gets to take his turn. He's like a time warper or something like
Hmm.
halfway through the fight he'll reset. Or like another one summons a bunch of minions. Another one um like when you kill him he resurrects, very classic. um uh I should check, they might be tied to the individual character now that I'm thinking about it. But they might not be. I need to but like there's like there's so much to do, and it's like a great, I don't know, I having it on my phone I think is like um super key to like me keeping playing just 'cause, like it's definitely too much of a game for like I'll try listening to a podcast with it and then I'll realize that I'm like not paying attention to the podcast because I'm paying too much attention to playing the game. um but it's like
Ooh, I feel that.
it's like I think it's the game that made me believe that mobile games could be good. And it was first a desktop game, but like these card game roguelites, I think are perfect kind of for this, for this mobile game space. Where like I don't have to like keep
Yeah.
up with it or feel bad with it like I do with like Hearthstone and Magic when I was playing. It's like, well, I gotta play every day to get like my cards because there's like a static thing. Whereas like these, it's fresh every run and there's some amount of progress, but it's not like tied to any time or anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's definitely true, and I like that. I like that interaction a lot. They've actually gotten away. I mean, I've complained about this before. They've gotten away from dungeon runs in recent like history. Um, so it's just like not been. Now they're doing what's called Book of Heroes. Um, Mobile MTG has just come out. Oh, I actually didn't realize that. So what they're doing in Hearthstone is Book of Heroes is like it's a solo adventure, but like you get a deck and you're playing through a storyline, right, of a couple of different, you know, card battles. But it'll be like Jaina, and you're learning about Jaina's whatever, like her past, but representative through like the different like the different decks she's playing and people she's like playing against, and that's like fun. That's what the classic Hearthstone adventures were, but they're just like not as engaging to me as like the dungeon runs were or have been. And I almost wonder, like, I know that is a bunch of people on the Hearthstone team moved off the Hearthstone team onto an unannounced project. um so I am kind of interested, and I think that might have been, like they once a bunch of people on the Dungeon Run team moved into another project at Blizzard, they didn't have anybody to replace it, so the Dungeon Runs have kind of sucked. That might be what's going on. But the other thing that they did is they actually turned Dungeon Run into a PvP mode where
really.
so it's sort of like Arena, right? Where you are like progressively fighting people with better and better decks. But like after every victory, or after every match, right? You pick up a bucket of cards. You have like the crazy powers. They're called duels. Um, which to me is sort of antithetical to what I want out of Dungeon Run. Like I like PvP Hearthstone, and I've obviously played a ton of PvP Hearthstone, but like I'm not super interested in like finding a PvP mode out of what should sort of be like blitz'em, do crazy bullshit combat, you know.
Right, because at
Um,
that point, it's highly luck dependent. And that can be super frustrating, I would imagine. Right,
Yeah,
like
yeah. And I do know that there are like good builds and like this character is good, this character is shitty, but like you can do this stuff with that and so there's a meta. And you once you create a meta game, I feel like that sucks a lot of fun out of the sort of adventurous side of
right,
like the roguelike stuff, right? Because like all of a sudden you're not like exploring, you know, part of what's doing the dungeon runs is so fun is that it just adds a little check mark whenever you beat the dungeon run with a certain thing, right? So, for instance, if I beat it with a certain hero power and with a certain deck, it'll give a little check mark on that deck, and I don't have to ever worry about it. Like I beat it with that deck, and that feels good because then I can move on and I can explore the possibility space of all these other decks and all these other hero powers and all this other stuff, right? Um, but if I'm just like but like anything with a metagame and anything like PvP related is almost always asking you to focus and drill, right? You want to get really good at your one thing because like the thing that's going to make or break your success is like your deep well of knowledge. And this is
yeah,
true.
you're
I
looking
mean,
for
this is true for
consistency.
PvE. This is also true for PvE content, right? Like this is true for raiding. This is true for Mythic Plus as well, right? But just like it's the creation of a meta that creates that sort of understanding. And I don't think that Dungeon Run ever really had a meta, or if it did, like it was very secondary. Like I'm sure there are people who wanted to beat Dungeon Run and like looked up guides, and there are people who say like, oh, you know this is how you do it or whatever. Um, but it's such a minor thing in comparison to sort of I don't know, just like playing it for yourself and having fun.
I agree. I agree. Um, you know about if there are any other these games? There must be, right? Like, um,
I know one of them. So one of the guys, Peter Whalen, who was the designer on Hearthstone for Dungeon Run, was basically poached. From he made a mobile game of this, and then Hearthstone was like, "Come work on Hearthstone," and then but then like I said, he moved to another project. What is the thing that he made before then? Prior to this, he's best known for creating the roguelike deck building RPG Dream Quest, which is an indie game on Steam. Yes, okay, I do know this. Um, so
interesting.
Dream Quest honestly might be like a very proto version of this. Dream Quest came out in 2014. It's very basic, like it has like very indie game vibes, but I do know that there are some other ones actually.
Oh,
Now that I'm
Hand of
looking at in
Fate. I'm looking at this.
Hand of Fate is huge. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's because it's got like an action component to it, right? Like you actually like fight the
Mm.
battles out on the map. Which I thought was interesting. I forgot
Dicey
I played that.
Dungeons is a neat one. I actually didn't know that that was a card battler, but it's by the guy. This guy's famous in like indie circles because he's done a bunch of Terry Kavanaugh. What did he do that's like this? Super Hexacon and VVV. Have you ever
Oh
done
yeah,
VVV?
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
that game was crazy. That came out when we were in college.
and that is a very uh like indie game. Like that's like a fundamental indie game, right? Like not great graphics, like a weird game. Yeah, no, I played a lot of those classic games. But yeah, it's a neat game.
Yeah, it was one of those ones that was sort of in that class of indie games that I actually played. Like I never played. Who's the guy that did Braid?
Oh,
Jonathan
well,
Blow.
yeah, Jonathan Blow. Yeah.
Yeah, like I never played Braid. I played Bastion, which was big around that time, but a lot of these were platformers, and I hated platformers. But I played this one because a friend of mine recommended it. Shout out to Prash if you're listening, which I know you're not. Because a friend of mine recommended it, and I thought it was just insanely clever. It was very hard. I was really bad at it because, like, I always have this problem with platformers. I don't have the same kind of like muscle memory that other people do for platformers. But just the swapping gravity mechanic, um, was like so cool and so huge. And this is now like a staple of the genre, right? Like Spinch has gravity swapping in World 6, for instance.
Yeah, no, and There was I forgot what I was saying about it, but yes, VVVV was great. It was like around that time also was when I think it's money like one of what's that guy's name? Maddie um I forgot the person's name. But he did a game called Money Seas, and then that turned into a I can find it. Did a bunch of games kind of in the space.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's actually a bunch of these now that I'm looking at that I do recognize. Nowhere Profit is a big one. I know the Nowhere Profit. That team is very cool and very smart. They have a really neat Discord where they're like constantly talking about sort of like the game and how it works and like asking really deep design questions of their community and stuff like that. That was really sweet. Monster Slayers is another one. That one came out recently, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, 2017. Which is another sort of like RPG, but you have like a whole party in it. There's actually a bunch of these now that I look at it. I kind of wish that I played more uh of these roguelike deck builders.
so the person I was thinking of was Maddie Thorson, who did Money Seas for famously made Celeste, which is excellent.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. That is famous.
Um, and Towerfall. But yes, is a like these kind of classic indie games is like a weird way to think about it, right? Like, but that's like surely what it is, right? Like, um, but yeah, um, I don't know if I've got a lot more to say about these deck builders though. Since
Me neither.
do you want to tell me about your week?
Yeah, so my week started with a big bang. And by start, I mean ended because we did it yesterday. I have achieved Keystone Master. So Keystone Master is getting 15s timed in all 8 dungeons of Shadowlands. And it gives you a mount. It's kind of the equivalent of Mythic rating, but like for Mythic plus dungeons. But it feels good to have it done because this was like kind of I this would be like became my focus over the course of Shadowlands. I was having so much fun doing mythics, and I eventually settled onto a mythics team where we were running every week with like the same core people, and we were like designing our own routes and stuff like that, and it was just like the perfect. I feel like when Blizzard was pitching mythics, right? As like an alternate source of gear, as sort of an alternate progression path in their internal meetings. They were pitching the version of Mythics that I was going through, uh, which was like finding a team and having people that are like really kind of solidly coming together, I guess I would say, um, to understand not only ourselves, like not only like as individuals, but like as a class. And there's a lot of really interesting like stuff and like innovations that kind of came out of that, which I think is sort of neat because 15s have maybe been some of the most challenging WoW content I've ever done. I also got Keystone Master in 8.3, and I got Keystone Master completely pugging in 8.3, right? Just like through pickup groups. But one, I was tanking. Two, I was incredibly well geared when we first started getting into mythics. Three, corruptions were a thing, and corruptions were super just insanely broken. And four, my class was incredibly meta. Protection warrior was the meta tank for late like the late stages of 8.3. Um, Whereas now I am DPS. Arms Warrior is very not meta. In fact, it's one of the worst specs in the game right now. Necrolord's Arms Warrior is the least meta of the least meta classes, right? So much so that, by the way, I am the best Necrolord's Arms Warrior in the world, according to Warcraft logs at this point. Mostly,
Yay!
there aren't any of us, right? but
There are dozens of
but
us.
yeah, but there were a lot of really interesting pieces of the puzzle that I didn't quite foresee that made Mythics really interesting. Like, so for instance, something that my team learned is that like it was actually sort of a mistake to follow the advice of builds and sims over sort of our own
Lived
ability to make
experience.
yeah, like experiences. Specifically, logs were very helpful for me. I learned a lot about myself because I was logging almost all of every time we would do mythics. I was logging them, right? And then I was going back and looking at those those logs. And I was learning a lot of like really interesting stuff. That should be the norm, says Phelanor in the chat. Absolutely, I agree with you. Um, because one of the things I was learning is, first of all, and I've talked about this before. First of all, nothing matters, which is to say that I typically did about the same DPS over the course of an entire dungeon, right? Um, that th- based on what I was picking, right? No matter what choice I was making, that DPS I was doing was going to be about the same. But the way in which the damage was happening kind of in the moments was very different, which I thought was incredibly interesting. So in the late stages of us pushing mythics, I was making lots of complex decisions about my build based on what dungeon we were doing and where we were sort of like falling in it. In our Mists 15, for instance, I was running anger management, which most people would have said like if like that is a very unmeta choice right now, and it's really weird if you look at the logs for where for what my build looks like compared to all the other warriors pushing plus 15s. But anger management was a really useful tool for my group specifically because of how it does damage and where the time lines up. So by its default, Bladestorm has a 1.5 minute cooldown, a 90-second cooldown. Anger management says every 20 rage you spend reduces that cooldown by 1. So what it really does is it shaves about 30 seconds off. It says that Bladestorm is a minute cooldown rather than a 1.5 minute cooldown, basically. Um, but one of the things in Mists of Tyr and Scythe is that dungeon has a lot of pulls that are, especially in the maze section, that you just can really blitz them down with Bladestorm. And each of those pulls takes, a minute-ish, right? And so being able to just like pump more blade storms in the middle there was actually able to save us a ton of time. It also has better cooldown windows and opportunities for the bosses in the dungeon on the week because I was able to fit 2 blade storms into a boss fight. Boss fights typically last around 90 seconds in like tyrannical 15s or whatever. I was able to fit 2 blade storms into each boss fight rather than just the one, which was a huge deal because I could basically open with blade storm and then finish the fight with blade storm, um, rather than have just I open with Bladestorm and then it comes off cooldown right as the boss is dying, which is a pretty like common thing. But I think a lot of that is obfuscated from players in a way. Um, but and I don't want to begrudge players, I guess, for just sort of like following the guides, following the sims or whatever. Um, because in a certain sense the WoW systems are so convoluted at this point that like it's really hard to understand them without the context of the computer of a computer, like without logs I never would have been able to make any of these decisions because I never would have been able to see the spikes in my damage just like graphically represented to me in a complete way. Um and for players who are not like me, who are just like following sims, without sims they don't have a good understanding of like, should I build all verse, should I build all mastery, should I do this, should I do that kind of thing. And I think that's, I don't know, I think that's
Yeah, it's
a
it's interesting, right? Because this is effectively going to the tape, right? Like, which is a thing you do in
yeah.
football, thing you do in sports, right? Thing you do in fighting games, right? Like, watch just like the piece of advice that I hear all the time from the people who are really into fighting games is like, watch your replays, right? But those things aren't going to be as visible. Like, even if you could just like record yourself playing, those things aren't going to be as visible to you because like it's like you could like I guess like read the numbers, but it's not as like visually striking as it is in kind of like a sports game or a fighting game where like you can see where things go right and go wrong. So the logs make sense to me. It's kind of an insight into that. And the Sims are kind of
Yeah,
like
logs were huge because like, so one of the things that I was able to see is when I was using Ravager, which is Ravager replaces Bladestorm. It puts a little spinny sword on the ground, and that sword generates rage, but you are specifically not spinning. So you can just cast normal shit while Ravager is up, right? Ravager made my DPS very bursty, where basically all of my DPS was coming in those 10-second Ravager windows, and then I was doing like very poor DPS in between those windows. And there were sometimes where that was really useful, and sometimes where that was really bad, right? Um, like an innovation that we had to do was, so Ingram Malik is the first boss of Tyrna Scythe, right? He has a huge health pool, and he has this tree guy with him. And the function of that fight, typically, like the mechanics of that fight are, you DPS down the tree guy, and then when the tree guy gets very low, he nukes Ingram Malik with a debuff that says he takes 200% more damage. Everybody pops their cooldowns and you blow up Ingram Malik. But we actually learned that it was incorrect for all of us to do that, because what would happen is we wouldn't get the tree down fast enough, right? The tree would stay up. Ingram Malik is progressively casting more and more dangerous stuff. Um, and so what was actually correct was for me to blow my cooldowns on the tree to get the tree down in a reasonable time, and for the other DPS in my party to save their cooldowns for Ingram Malik, because that was then how they were going to take advantage of the debuff and really like blitz the debuff. And those kinds of decisions, like, I can't make that without logs, right? Like maybe I can make that on feel, like I feel the DPS isn't fast enough. We're not doing enough DPS to really like get things down. But yeah, it was I guess I don't know. It was just like huge to make that kind of an innovation be like, oh wow, this makes like a gigantic difference in how we like in how we approach the dungeon. But most of the time, it's not it wasn't even all that much like rotational stuff. A lot of the innovations we were making were just like small mechanics things. Um, a big thing was charting paths throughout the dungeon. I almost want to do a whole podcast on this, where I just want to like give people recommendations. Like this is how we did it. But like one of the things that we really did to get Keystone Master was we made our own routes. So we made the kinds of routes that we liked and were comfortable with, and then we were drilling those routes essentially, right? Because like something that can really fuck people up, I think, especially if they're pugging, is that a lot of the time like there is sort of just like weird stuff happening with the roots and what you're pulling, and that's like really dangerous because like people aren't always on the same page for what's coming out where and who's paying attention to like to what kind of thing. It's just like so it's like it really puts my mind at ease to know what the next four pulls all look like because we've run this 3 times by now. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. No, it's I I'd be interested. So I don't know if we could turn it into a full episode, but I do think it'd be interesting to see that process. I also similarly think it'd be interesting to like quiz like Sarian about doing that for raid, because I figure it's a similar
Hmm.
process. Although there's like it's a little bit more of a kind of like Sarian's a little bit more in kind of like the commander role, right? Because he doesn't have to contribute as much, like as opposed to like the squad leader role, which is what I'm kind of assigning to you, like smaller
Yeah.
5-man unit. Yeah, it's super
It's
super.
also it's also a little bit different because like you have to make choices in a Mythic Plus that are very different than choices you have to make during a raid encounter. So for instance, it took us 8 tries to get the other side, which is the hardest dungeon in the game, done in time. And part of that is that like if you screw up a pull early, you generally speaking still have time. You still have time to make up that difference. But like now you're making different decisions, and I can see almost like a speed run, right? Like I can see like, okay, when the last time we did this, we lost 2 minutes from our best time, right? We need to make these 2 minutes up, which is going to mean pulling packs more proactively. It's going to mean combining certain pulls together that we would normally do like separately and discreetly. And that stuff is obviously like very risky, but like it's pretty necessary, like when those sorts of changes get made. Part of this is that this is an interesting thing about the design of Mythic Plus that I don't think people really understand. It is it is paradoxically easier and harder to time dungeons on tyrannical weeks where bosses are more difficult than on fortified weeks where trash is more difficult, right? People normally say fortified weeks are easier. Trash has less mechanics to deal with. Most people build their Mythic Plus characters around big AoE pulls, so it's very normal to do big AoE pulls. You're blade storming a lot. You're doing lots of big AoE damage. That feels good. That feels right, right? Compared to tyrannical weeks where you're not really doing that much because like the trash just kind of falls over dead essentially. Um, but because of the numbers. So fortified increases the health of all the mobs in all the trash mobs by 10%, and their damage by, or I'm sorry, the health by 20%, their damage by 10%. And tyrannical is 30 and 15, I think. So it's 30% more health, 15% more damage. You save a lot more time on a tyrannical week because the trash just falls over, basically, right? You don't really have to worry about, you just kill it pretty effortlessly comparatively to a fortified week. But your risk of wiping is much higher because the bosses are more difficult, right? The bosses are universally going to be more difficult and are going to lead to wipes because when they go that long, right, like you can screw up mechanics, and those mechanic screw ups can be like really fatal. But you gain so much time. Like on this week we timed 15 Plaguefall and we actually wiped against the final boss, but we had 7 minutes left on the timer, so we just came back and did it again and we got it. Just because like we saved so much more time by doing it on like the tyrannical week rather than doing it on the fortified week, which is like a really interesting interaction because like it's sort of saying like, okay, the fortified key is easier, but you have to run it perfectly. You can't fuck it up anywhere because if you do, you whiff on time, right? The tyrannical week is riskier because it's easier to wipe on those bosses, right? But you have a little bit more cushion, you have a little bit more room in there to make things, to make things work out.
That makes sense to me. Um, so I have a question. Kind of how,
Sure.
so how do you feel about like, and this is kind of in general, right? Like about switching up talents for situations, right? That was the thing that I kind of in my gut. Like I want my character to be the way I talent him, and that's like my expert. Like that, this is how this character is. I've built him this way. Obviously the game I think has gone in a different direction. Where if you want to like squeeze out little pieces um, damage, or of effectiveness rather. You should be talenting, for each, in rating it's for each encounter for mythics you're locked in for the dungeon, right?
So what I think of and what I like is sort of the line between viability and so first of all, yes, in Mythics you're locked, right? So once you enter the dungeon, you can't make any changes. Um, what I'm interested in terms of like is like the line between viability and optimization. I think it's cool that I was making these kinds of optimizations to go anger management in this week's Mists of Tyranus Scythe because it's specifically tyrannical and I know the dungeon and I looked at the logs and I made the correct conclusions that this was the right way to go. And by the way, on fortified it's better to go Ravager because you get 2 Ravager windows in some of the trash pulls. But that's a different story. Um, and like I like that as a very high level player with an incredible mastery of my class, right? I am able to discern and make those kinds of decisions. That's like super cool, super valuable to me. And by the way, it extends past just just talents. Extends to conduits. This extends to soulbinds. This extends to legendaries, right? Like any of these things that are like kind of in the package of creating a build. However, I also think that you can just have a build and do it and it works out. Like one of the dungeons, I mistakenly had my raid build. This was last week on the fortified week, which would be the worst week to do this because on fortified you really want to go for AOE, right? I was in my raid build, which is insanely single target, and we actually timed a dungeon, one of the 15s that we were looking to time, even though I had made that mistake, just because like at the end of the day, my DPS was about the same, and it actually turned out that having someone who was very dedicated to single target was really useful because 2 other people in my party were super spec for AoE at that point. So we didn't need more AoE blitzing from, a super Bladestorm focused AoE build. We actually benefited from having somebody who could, one, really single target down certain mobs, and to provide a little bit of like DPS kind of contrast compared to others. Like so, for instance, um, fire mages right now are like the big meta spec. The big meta specs I would say right now are fire mages, boomkins, marksmanship hunters. The marksmanship hunters are kind of dropping a little bit because they fixed a bug that was giving them damage. All 3 of those classes are really burst focused classes. For druids, it's burst around convoke the spirits. For fire mages, it's burst around combustion, and for marksmanship, it's burst around true shot wild spirits, like the combo of those two abilities. A a group that is those 3 classes would probably have a really tough time on Ingram Malik, which I was describing earlier, because unless one of those classes is burning their cooldowns on the tree, which they are not trained to do, right? We train those classes to burn your cooldowns on the big DPS window. Um, it is actually, like you are kind of like being it is detrimental, and you can like really hurt yourself having that kind of a setup walking into like certain fights and certain bosses. But I also think that, in general, if you just want to be the person that has a build and that is your build and that's how you want to approach each dungeon or each encounter or whatever, you're probably fine, to be honest. Um, I could have run the Dreadnought build and been good for everything. Um, and it was sort of my baseline build for these 15s, right? Like it was the one where if I didn't have a good reason to go something else, I was going the Dreadnought build, which is what is recommended by all the guides, right? Like they say that this is the best. So I guess that's my feeling about it.
Fair enough.
But do you feel like you're interested in other aspects of Windwalker Bunk? Like, are you interested in seeing what Windwalker plays out with different legendaries, different build types, or whatever? Or is that not something that you find compelling?
It's something that I think I could like. I would find it compelling if all I wanted to do was play WoW. Um,
Hmm.
and there's definitely a part of me that's like, I want Billabong to be the way that I built him because that's how I envisioned the character. Right? There's not a ton
Sure.
of like customization left in there anyway, right? Just because the game's kind of like the game by necessity has to be you know variable within a couple percentage points to keep everybody happy, right? And so like theoretically, I have a vision for Billabong with like oh, and he chose these talents because there's a theme. It's not really right, like not like he's like there's a super flavorful spec for like the choices I've made. But like I like Touch of Death, and I want to be able to use my Touch of Death legendary when I can, and like that's fun to me. But like it's not like a thing that I super care about, right? Like I pick up the raid shoulders, picked up the raid shoulders because that's the thing that I was supposed to do, and I saw DPS increase for it, and sure, that that's nice. Um, I don't have the time, or rather, my desire to do all this analysis that you've done is less than my desire to go play a different game, right? Like,
Sure.
and demands on my time type of deal, right? Like, I got Monster Runner Rise on Friday, and I haven't been able to play it yet. I'm probably gonna play it after we finish here, and that might be after I go do finish some stuff in WoW. Like, it's already taking a lot of my time that I want to be able to put it other places. So, I don't
Yeah,
have,
I feel that for sure.
yeah, and
I mean, part of it is that I legitimately get a dopamine hit out of seeing my numbers.
no,
And
I
this is
get it.
like this is the thing that I made fun of in Battle for Azeroth, right? Specifically because it really hurt when I wasn't top. And so I got really invested in having good numbers, and then I would be really mad and angry if I didn't have good numbers. It was almost like League of Legends at that point, where like the wins are sort of methadone, right? And the losses are like going through withdrawal, and there is no high anymore, essentially. But I'm not at that point anymore because now I just like ambiently know that good numbers are good. Like I know what numbers are good, and seeing good numbers makes me feel good rather than seeing them in relation to someone else's, right? Like it doesn't bother me that like I get trounced in raid by people all the time. Phalanor beats me in raid on a lot of fights, even though I have like 6 eye levels and a ton of shit. Like hypothetically speaking, I probably should be out DPSing Phalanor, but that doesn't bother me at all anymore. Um, but it feels good to like look at the logs and be like, oh, I made this choice and it really paid off. So like so good. And also to answer the question in the chat, so is WoW going on the back burner for Buddy now that KSM is there? Honestly, I just want to run more. This is what I said to Savadar last night, who's also been gunning pretty hard for Keystone Master. Like he was like, I want to get it so I can like go do other stuff with my time, and that's fair enough, right? Um, but one of the nice things about getting a team together is that like really it's when the team is there and they're like, we're free in this window, let's do our runs, right? Um, that I can plan around that sort of thing. So if I don't want to, I can just I've actually been playing other games. I've been playing Gears Tactics, which I put like 10 hours into this week,
Huh.
which is sort of the Gears of War XCOM, which we can talk about in a bit. Um, but yeah, after getting KSM, now I just want to run more because KSM unlocks Valor point upgrades up to 220. So like now I just want to like run dungeons. I'm probably gonna run dungeons after this actually, on my alts to get them gear. I want to run dungeons to fill out my vault each week. I'm probably going to keep going for the 10 chest at 14s. Just because like opening the vault is like Christmas morning every week for me, right? Um, so I don't think WoW's going to end up on the back burner. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna continue to play
No,
it. Though I will say that I'm playing less WoW now than I was maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Specifically because I'm not pugging anymore. When I was pugging mythics all the time, that takes a lot of time. Um, so yeah.
no, no. I actually have enjoyed doing doing battlegrounds like every once in a while, just like
Oh really?
yeah, just because like it's I don't know why it is, but like it feels like it's always a blowout one way or the other, and like on like a Arathi Basin, it seems to be like Horde blows out pretty hard, but I find it fun, right? Like I just like derping around, like killing people. I feel like I've got some good moments. I don't think it's because I'm good, because like if I ever one-on-one anybody that's like halfway decent, it's like occasionally when most of the time it's kind of like, oh, there's a paladin and the paladin has the paladin has like used all of his bullshit and I can't touch him anymore, and now I'm dead. So and I
Yeah,
don't care
I
enough to
might get
learn.
into arenas because now my mythics team we're like, are we just gonna keep running mythics? And the answer was yes, because we're gonna like do the vault. But I'm also like insanely geared at this point, and part of me feels like I should just be able to like walk into arenas and just like completely dumpster people, just because like I'm sitting on all this 226 gear, right?
Hmm.
Which is probably not the truth because I don't have any versatility, which is the most important PvP stat. Um, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, it's PvP is a different beast, but it's still fun. Especially BGs. BGs is BGs are fun because no one's like it's not coordinated. Random BGs. I'm not doing rated
Yeah.
battlegrounds, right? Like random BGs are like
Oh,
people with
I have always been really interested in doing rated battlegrounds. It's like impossible because it's 10 people. Like it feels like getting 10 people together to do RBGs is like that's just like a lot of people, obviously.
yeah, and
Especially to get a lot of people with the right role, like melee ranged healers, that kind of stuff. But I think joining an RBG team and like going hard on RBGs would actually be super fun.
I think I agree. I just don't like. I don't know if I've got like the skills for that, right? Like, I'm looking forward to Guilty Gear Strive coming out in June and like putting all of my PvP like, wantingness into that game. So, um
Yeah.
that type of thing. But yeah. Uh what else? I didn't do a lot with my week. I played a bunch of Slay the Spire, which you just talked about for an hour. And I what else did I I watched some I took a vacation to Providence, Rhode Island over the weekend. Which is
Wow.
yeah, it's a
Big
city.
money.
Yeah, I mean it's so I'm in New Hampshire, so it's not super
Yeah.
far away. Um I went and saw the mansions in Newport, which is like an hour south of Providence. Like it's a thing apparently. They're very nice houses. Um but in the hotel I ended up watching some diners, drive-ins and dives. Uh
Oh my God, that's the Guy Fieri show, right?
yeah, yeah. And
Who we
apparently
have all decided is great,
yeah,
right? Like
he
he's
is
not
great.
canceled,
Yeah,
even though we made fun of him for a long time.
I mean, he's funny looking, but he leaned into it too. Like if you follow his Instagram, just like him posting Guy Fieri memes or whoever runs the social media account posting like Guy Fieri's face pasted on top of like whatever the popular meme is that week. Like I haven't looked recently, but I'm sure they've got like a ever given thing with him. Wouldn't surprise me at all or something like that. But it's just like funny to see like that whole I like like I just kind of had it on in the background and it went on for like it kept playing right like just over and over and then like it would be like this is Triple D Nation. What's Triple D Nation? It's like them going back to the places that they went to earlier during drivers and dives, and like half of those episodes are just are just like the previous. It's like half of the new segment or of the segment on the show is a replay of the old content. So it's just like okay, as
I have never understood or interacted with like food network kinds of shows like that. But I have watched a couple of episodes of Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives and found them very compelling. Let's be honest.
it is
And
like
also
WestCon
Anthony
2021.
Bourdain's show, but I think Anthony Bourdain's show is like the high class version of that because he talks about like I don't know, like the politics of wherever he is. Like, oh, this is Myanmar, and here they use peanut oil, and also there's a fucking coup. Like,
Oh yeah, but Driver's Dine and Dives is like yeah, and then here they make like a sandwich with like a big old piece of steak on it. It's crunchy.
I think it's honestly just like it is just like the fantasy of eating the food, right? Like
Yeah,
that's the
no,
thing that
absolutely. And it's, and you can tell sometimes he's not as in. Apparently, they put a lot of work into making sure he's like going to decent places. But like, there's like a place, like 40 minutes away from me that was on the show. It's great, right? Like I love that place. I can take my parents there when they come to visit, right? Like it's not like high class, like it's fine dining, right? But it's it's good. It's solid kind of driver's diving. It's exactly what it
my
sounds like,
my
right?
example of that is Tanked, I want to call it. It's a Discovery Channel show about a Las Vegas aquarium company. These like guys who make aquariums. Um, and it's like a reality show, and they get these like what it always is. This is what the show is, and I've only watched maybe 4 episodes, but I have a deep understanding of the lore of this show. Okay, what it always is some famous big money person, typically, right? Like a basketball star or like a football player or something, comes there and he says, "Hey, I want a fucking aquarium and I want it to be this." And he describes something that everyone goes, "That's impossible." Actually, they have really thick New York accent. They're like, "That's impossible. We're never going to be able to put that together." And then the show is them inevitably figuring out, oh, well, if we curl the fiberglass this way, we can make it so that, whoever, this guy's fish do this thing that he wants. Ho ho, we're so smart. But it's also like there's like a grandpa, and there's like a dad, and then there's like the bratty kid, and it's like like three of them. They're all in the family, and it's also filled
Are
with
you
these
watching Pawn
dumb.
Stars?
Yeah, no, it is exactly like that. It's exactly like Pawn Stars. It is filled with these like dumb hijinks. Like there's one where the grandpa keeps telling them to like eat roadkill, and he improvises a grill out of it's like a toilet seat, and he has like he like gets a lizard, and he grills it in the parking lot, and I'm like, this is so obviously staged and not real. That's not actually fucking roadkill. Like this is the dumbest shit of all time. But I just found it intensely compelling to watch. Like I couldn't stop myself.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that. I definitely get that. Like, man, my dad watches a ton of these shows too. But
I know my dad also watches a ton of these shows.
I need to find this. Uh, so
Okay, I'm actually lying. It's not 3 generations. It's just two. It is Brett Raymer, Wade King, Brett's sister Heather, who is married to Wade, so they're brother-in-laws. And then Brett's father, who's known as the General, and there's the General who's the one that like cooked the roadkill or whatever. This is the perfect show. It is the perfect show for putting on in a hotel room when you just have like 40 minutes to kill before everybody
oh
gets ready
yeah,
for dinner or whatever.
so a number of years ago, I went to EDC with friends, which is a big electronic music concert in Vegas. I'm with a couple of friends of the cast, and like during like the times when we weren't like drinking or like getting ready to go dance, it's literally overnight. It's in Vegas, so and it's outdoors,
Yeah.
so it's literally has to be overnight so people don't die. Um, uh, uh, we just had like we turned on the Travel Channel, and it was just 20. It was a whole weekend marathon of John Taffer's Bar Rescue, which is just like this like loud, obnoxious guy. Like like it's like a Kitchen Nightmares, but for bars, and also like significantly more trashy, and just like for years the meme was like Don Julio Premium Tequila, because that was very clearly who had sponsored the show. It was always the thing. You'd be like, and to class up your drink, you're gonna bring in some Don Julio Premium Tequila, and like we're like watching this all weekend, and like the last day, it's like, in this episode, we go to the Don Julio Premium Tequila Distillery. It's like,
That's amazing.
yeah.
That's good shit.
Um,
Um
but so
God.
I do want to recommend a YouTube video that I watched about a week ago called "Despair on the Jersey Shore" by Finch. I'll put it in the description because it's about this, and it's like basically a thesis on like it's kind of one of these analysis videos, but it's like Finch is not a huge channel, but it's like a half hour analysis on what like like what makes these reality shows stick and why the Jersey Shore is much more successful than like a lot of its kind of brethren. Um, and it's basically about how like you're throwing a bunch of people into like a fishbowl and pointing a camera at them, and and they're like highly dysfunctional people in the first place. So it's a lot of like Schadenfreude and whatnot. It's a good watch. I
Yeah.
have
The other thing I've been watching, by the way, completely unrelated to this and is very good, is The Expanse, which I have not watched a lot of. I've watched the first 9 episodes. Holy shit, that show is great.
I've heard. I
And
need to.
like,
It's on the list.
it is giving me big Game of Thrones vibes. The thing that's cool about it is it does that Game of Thrones thing where like it is following different characters in different locations who are all like working on the same thing in a sense, but they don't know it or whatever. And like I that is the structure that made Game of Thrones really great, especially in its early seasons, and it's here in The Expanse and it's so good. And I don't know that I've like felt so like just compelled to continue watching television. Actually, I guess maybe since The Boys, because I watched The Boys this way, but The Boys I think is not good. Like it's fine. It's just like it's head empty. It doesn't have a lot on its mind, right? Um, Whereas like The Expanse has like big stuff going on. It's got big thoughts in its brain, which is really sweet and really nice. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but like the kind of lore is that the Expanse had 2 seasons, I believe, on Sci-Fi, and then Jeff Bezos was like, "We need to save the Expanse and put it on Amazon Prime." Um, like, or we need a Sci-Fi show or something. But like the legend is that Jeff Bezos liked the Expanse so much is that he personally intervened to make sure it got on Amazon Prime.
that's
Um,
amazing. I
yeah,
mean, the show is great. I can't believe more people don't talk about it, man. Like people going apeshit for like WandaVision, and I'm just like, boy, let's talk about The Expanse, please, because it's
have,
like nowhere on my Twitter. It feels like.
speaking of Marvel shows, have you watched any of the Winter Soldier yet?
Oh no, I do
Or
want to,
Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
but
Yeah, neither have I.
I
I think I'm probably gonna binge it at the end or something. I don't
yeah, I
know.
will maybe
We'll
binge it at the
probably
end.
do an episode on
The
it, right?
the funny thing is, I had this specific thought because I was sitting there. So I was playing Gears Tactics, which I also didn't talk about. Gears Tactics is fun, and it's fun in the same way that XCOM is. So like I get to just sort of turn my brain off a little bit, and I'm watching something on my other screen. Um, and I was just like mindlessly scrolling, and I had started watching a couple things, right? Like I watched Silicon Valley. I watched like 5 seasons of Silicon Valley, but that show just kind of became like anxiety inducing in a way because just like I don't know, I got weirdly invested in like the characters and the drama, and so like things always in that show are about how like terrible everything always goes, and that's like funny, but like when I'm relating too closely to the characters, that feels like oh, no, or whatever, and I just like couldn't take it anymore. I just didn't want that drama in my life. I wanted something easier and lighter to go on, I guess. And then I started watching for some reason fucking Band of Brothers, which I've
I
never
was
seen.
like, I was say like lighter. Like you mentioned the Expanse. Now you're telling me Band of Brothers. And you're like, oh,
Yeah,
something lighter.
I know, I know. And to be honest, the Band of Brothers kind of sucks. I think, which sucks because I like I know the story. Like the story of Easy Company is like famous to a certain extent. Like I understand the 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 core premise, I guess I would say, of like the Band of Brothers story, right? Because Easy Company are these paratroopers who uh are essentially playing through the very back half of World War II, going kind of like town to town. And I'm pretty sure the way this was shot was with um uh what's that Saving Private Ryan, right?
Hmm.
So it's like very much in that vein, came out right around that time. It launched the careers for a lot of good people. Oh, by the way, tanked the Seabiscuit of television. That's a great reference, and absolutely true in that Seabiscuit is the movie you put on in the hotel room to watch for 2 hours while you're waiting for whatever, like you find that on HBO Z or something. But anyway, but it's just I just don't think that the storytelling mode of long form serialized like mini series in the same way that we would think of like Chernobyl, or something like that would come out like nowadays. Chernobyl also, by the way, I watched the entire thing when I was seeking something to lower my anxiety from watching Silicon Valley. What a world we live in. And so there's just like a lot of like meandering bullshit in Band of Brothers. It's like terrible and bad and slow, and like the action scenes are shot incoherently in a way that I find like impossible to keep up with the geography of what's going on. Like because everyone's constantly yelling. There's like guns and everything there, and they're like,
Isn't
but they're
that the
also
point?
no, no, that is the point. But they're also giving like tactical information, right? So if you want to, maybe I'm just approaching this in the wrong way. Like so, for instance, in the World War II movie Fury, directed by David Ayer of award-winning Suicide
It's like
Squad
the
fame,
tank one.
it's the tank one. That movie is really great because it's very centered on the tank, and there's a lot of shelling and blowing up and everything, but like it's almost like the sound drops out a little bit, and I'm sure this is true in the mix, so that you can hear like the kind of tactical decisions that are getting made at any time, right? Like there's one part where their tank is going up against 3 other tanks. They're fighting. They first are fighting 2 tanks, and then they realize that they're about to go into an ambush on a 3rd tank, and it's incredibly well done such that like I'm following the action just like point by point, decision by decision in a really clear way. Band of Brothers is like the opposite of that. It is horrendously unclear what anything is going on at any time. And to be honest, there's a lot of friendly fire, so maybe that's the point. Like there's a part where a dude just fucking bayonets another guy in Easy Company, and I was just like, holy shit! And the funny part, they play that like a joke, like ha ha ha. Myers is so dumb. I don't know if it was Myers. Myers is so dumb. He fucking bayoneted this other guy because he thought he was he was like wearing a raincoat, so he looked like a Nazi because they have like a longer coat than the GIs did. But anyway, so then I was watching Band of Brothers, and then I started watching The Expanse. We're just going right down the line of weirdly not anxiety inducing shows. Silicon Valley, the sitcom, tremendously anxiety inducing for me.
Yeah, no, I watched Band of Brothers and the I forget what the name of it is, but there's one set in the South Pacific that's kind of like the companion show.
Oh yeah, the Pacific.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Pacific. Yeah. I watched it. I watched it in college actually with friend of the cast Barry. I also think I watched
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Fury with
See, this
him.
is the other thing. Barry always told me to watch Band of Brothers. It was like his favorite thing.
Yeah. No,
I bet if I had watched it 10 years ago, I would have liked it more.
yeah,
Because I think TV has grown up a lot since then.
I really enjoyed it. It's just it's been forever, so I can't even tell you how much. But yeah.
Yeah, this is just like mining the depths of TV history, basically. Um, you know, but yeah, man, I watched the. You know what it is? It really is the thing about it that makes weirdly Chernobyl not anxiety inducing comparatively is that it's sort of competency porn, right? Like people talk about this sort of. The Martian is also this, where it's like there's no really antagonist, there's no bad guy. It's just like dire circumstances, right? But people are thinking like they're constantly like kind of thinking their way out of this and coming up with clever solutions. And that is most of what Chernobyl is, even if there are some parts that just like, fuck with my brain, like those 2 guys that looked at the reactor and then died because they just looked at the reactor.
But we're over time, so I think we
Yeah.
should probably wrap it up. If you'd like to tell us what you thought about any things we talked about on this show, you can email us at gmail.com or podcast@games.com. Plus, twitch.tv/games. Please go out live. Be watching us now and saying PogChamp at us like front of the cast, hyper-indexed. You can follow us on YouTube where these get uploaded eventually if I remember to do them. And we are on SoundCloud and all other places that podcasts are, and those go up much more quickly after this does than the YouTube video does usually. Sometimes the YouTube video goes up quickly if I can remember. But I think that's everything I had. Buddy, you have anything else you're looking to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking. Oh, actually, I will be playing But It Gets Good this Friday on a game that I can't announce yet, actually, but it's a very cool game, and I'm super excited to talk about it. It's not like a huge thing, but
Is it a
it's
game?
it's gonna be neat.
Is it an unreleased? Can you even tell? Is it an unreleased game, or you're just like not allowed to say what game it is? You're not allowed to say anything about it.
You'll figure it out tomorrow.
Okay.
Pay attention. Pay attention to the Akupara feed tomorrow, and you'll see what's it. This is not like a huge. This is not like a huge thing, but it is a very cool thing, and I'm glad that I get to do it because this kind of thing is sweet. These are like the perks. These are like the perks of my job. Um.
All right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll see that then tomorrow. And until then, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.